The autumn sun had barely risen over the quiet suburban streets when two teenagers stepped out of their red brick home, backpacks slung over their shoulders. The brother and sister had their morning routine down to a science. She'd grab their packed lunches from the fridge while he'd do one final check of their homework assignments. Their dad, a respected state senator, was already up and dressed in his usual crisp suit, reviewing documents for his morning committee meeting. "Don't forget your basketball gear," their father called out from his home office, his voice carrying that warm mix of authority and care that parents somehow perfect over the years. "You've got practice after school today." The kids shared a knowing look. Their dad never forgot anything, and neither did they. But it was his way of showing love, keeping track of their daily lives even while juggling his demanding role in state politics. The morning air had that perfect crispness to it, the kind that made their walks to school feel refreshing rather than tedious. The sister, a sophomore with dreams of becoming a civil rights attorney like their late mom, was telling her brother about her upcoming debate tournament. Her brother, a freshman who'd already made the varsity basketball team, listened while absent-mindedly dribbling an imaginary ball. Their neighborhood was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, Mr. Lee watering his prized roses, Mrs. Rodriguez walking her golden retriever, and old Mr. Wilson collecting his morning paper in his eternally present robe and slippers. The siblings waved as they passed each familiar face, their feet falling into the comfortable rhythm of their daily route. They passed the local convenience store, its windows still decorated with fading back-to-school sale signs. The owner's cat sat in its usual spot by the door, watching the world go by with half-closed eyes. The sister pulled out her phone to show her brother a funny meme about their dad's latest speech in the Senate, something about him accidentally using youth slang that had gone viral in the best possible way. Their laughter echoed down the street as they shared this private joke, their bond evident in the way they walked in sync, occasionally bumping shoulders or finishing each other's sentences. They'd grown even closer after losing their mom 3 years ago, and their morning walks had become a sacred time for just the two of them to talk, joke, and sometimes just exist together in comfortable silence. The school was only 10 minutes away now, and they could see other students starting to filter onto the sidewalks, backpacks bobbing, earbuds in place, all moving with that early morning teenage shuffle. The sister was explaining her ideas for the upcoming student council meeting, something about improving the school's recycling program, when their ordinary morning took an unexpected turn. Nobody could have predicted how the next few minutes would change not just their lives, but their entire community. The siblings had no way of knowing that their regular Tuesday morning walk would become a watershed moment in their father's career and their city's approach to law enforcement. But sometimes the biggest changes start in the most ordinary moments, on the most ordinary days, with the most ordinary actions. Their father had always taught them about dignity, about knowing their rights, and about staying calm in difficult situations. He prepared them for moments like what was about to happen, though he'd hoped they'd never need those lessons. As they approached the final stretch of their walk to school, the sound of an approaching police cruiser would mark the end of their regular morning routine and the beginning of something much bigger than themselves. What happened next would test everything their father had taught them, challenge their community's perception of safety and justice, and ultimately lead to changes that would ripple far beyond their quiet suburban street. But in that moment, they were just two kids walking to school, sharing stories and laughs, living in what would turn out to be the last few minutes of their regular morning routine. The police cruiser rolled to a stop beside them with a soft crunch of gravel, its presence instantly changing the morning air from crisp to heavy. The brother and sister exchanged a quick glance, their father's words echoing in their minds. "Stay calm, know your rights, and remember who you are." The sister's hand instinctively reached for her phone, letting it slip partially out of her pocket, another lesson their father had taught them. 2 officers stepped out of the vehicle, their boots hitting the pavement with deliberate thuds. The taller officer approached first, his hand resting casually on his belt. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he asked, his tone carrying an edge that didn't match the peaceful morning. The brother adjusted his varsity basketball jacket, standing a little straighter. "We live here, sir," he replied, his voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through him. "We're walking to school." The shorter officer circled around them, eyes scanning their backpacks. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," he said, though when pressed later, no such reports would be found. The sister clutched her debate team folder closer, the sharp edges of her perfectly organized notes pressing against her sweater. "Officer, we're just going to school," she repeated, her voice carrying the same measured tone she used in debate competitions. "We live 3 blocks from here." Without warning or permission, the taller officer reached for the brother's backpack. "We're going to need to check these bags," he announced, not asked. The brother's hand tightened on the strap, remembering his father's voice during one of their many discussions about rights. "They need probable cause or your consent. Don't be confrontational, but know your rights." "Sir," the brother said, his heart pounding but his voice remaining respectful, "I don't consent to a search." "May I ask what probable cause you have?" The officers exchanged looks, clearly not expecting such a composed and informed response from a teenager. The sister had already pressed the emergency contact button on her phone, a silent SOS to their father. She knew the layout of her phone so well she could do it without looking, another skill practiced during family discussions about potential scenarios just like this. The morning sun caught the officers' badges, and the sister made mental notes of the numbers, just as they'd been taught. Other students were starting to walk by, slowing their pace, phones partially raised. The scene was drawing attention, which seemed to make the officers increasingly uncomfortable. Still, they pressed on. "Empty your bags," the shorter officer insisted, his tone somewhere between demanding and uncertain. The brother and sister stood their ground, maintaining eye contact but not moving to comply. They'd been raised to respect law enforcement, but also to understand their constitutional rights. The sister spoke up, her debate training evident in her clear, controlled voice. "Officers, we're happy to provide our school IDs, but we don't consent to an unlawful search. We're simply walking to school as we do every morning." The tension in the air was thick enough to touch. A small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance. Other students, a few parents walking their younger children to the elementary school, the convenience store owner stepping outside to watch. The officers seemed increasingly aware of the growing audience, their initial confidence wavering as phones recorded the interaction. The brother kept his hands visible, another lesson from their father. His basketball gear shifted in his bag, the mesh of his practice jersey visible through the partially open zipper. The sister maintained her calm exterior, though her hand trembled slightly as she held her debate folder. They were doing everything right, everything they'd been taught, but the fear was still there, running beneath their composed surface like an electric current. Time seemed to stretch like taffy, each second drawing out longer than the last. The morning bell would ring in 15 minutes, but that seemed like a concern from another universe now. The officers continued their questioning, their words becoming more circular as they searched for justification they didn't have. "Where exactly do you live? What's in the bags? Why are you out this early?" Each question met with respectful but firm responses from the siblings. A car door slammed in the distance, the sound sharp against the tense quiet that had fallen over the scene. The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling through like waves. Someone was walking toward them with purposeful steps, someone in a suit with a Senate pin glinting on his lapel. The regular morning that had twisted into something frightening was about to take another turn, one that would send ripples through their community and beyond. The siblings could feel the change coming, could sense the shift in the air as their father approached. They maintained their composed stance, knowing that what happened next would matter not just for them, but for every kid who looked like them, for every parent who had to have the same difficult conversations their father had with them. The regular Tuesday morning had become something else entirely, a moment that would test everything they'd learned, everything they believed in, and everything their community thought it knew about itself. The brother and sister stood shoulder to shoulder on the sidewalk, their shadows stretching long in the morning sun. Despite the fear churning in their stomachs, they remembered every word of their father's teachings about moments like this. Their parents hadn't just prepared them for academic success or athletic achievement, they'd prepared them for life, including its hardest moments. The sister's fingers moved swiftly over her phone screen, hidden partially by her debate folder. Years of texting under her desk during boring classes had given her the ability to type without looking, a skill that now proved unexpectedly valuable. On Pine Street, 2 officers. Badge numbers 4479 and 4512. "We're okay." The message went to their father's phone with a silent whoosh. Her brother stood perfectly still, his varsity jacket catching the morning breeze. He kept his hands where they could be seen, his movements deliberate and calm. When he spoke, his voice carried the same steady confidence he used during basketball team captain speeches. "Officers, we understand you're doing your job, but we know our rights. We're respectfully declining this search." The convenience store owner had stepped closer, pretending to organize the newspaper stand. His presence felt like a silent support, a witness to what was unfolding. Other students had stopped too, forming small clusters at a safe distance, their phones raised like tiny mirrors catching the scene. The sister noticed all of this while maintaining her composed expression, her debate training proving useful in ways she'd never expected. The basketball in her brother's backpack shifted as he adjusted his stance, making a soft thump. The sound seemed to irritate the taller officer, who stepped forward again. "Listen, kids, this would go a lot faster if you just cooperate." The words hung in the air like heavy smoke, but the siblings didn't waver. They'd learned about this too, how pressure to cooperate often meant pressure to give up their rights. The sister spoke next, her voice clear and steady, the same tone she used when presenting closing arguments in debate competitions. "Sir, we've identified ourselves as students walking to school. We've shown you our school IDs. Without probable cause, you don't have the right to search our bags. We're happy to answer your questions, but we know our rights." A small breeze rustled through the trees lining the street, carrying the scent of Mr. Lee's roses from down the block. The moment felt surreal, the ordinary morning scents and sounds continuing while this extraordinary scene played out. The brother's hand found his sister's elbow, a small gesture of support they'd developed after losing their mom. They drew strength from each other, just as they had during those difficult days. The shorter officer shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation was unfolding. These weren't the scared, uninformed kids he'd expected to encounter. These teenagers spoke with knowledge and dignity, their composure making his actions seem increasingly questionable. The growing crowd of onlookers added to his discomfort, their phones recording every word, every movement. The sister continued documenting everything mentally, just as she'd been taught. Time: approximately 7:45 a.m. Location: corner of Pine and Maple. Weather: clear, sunny. Officers' descriptions, badge numbers, patrol car number. Her debate training in gathering and organizing information was serving her well, helping to keep her focused despite the fear still fluttering in her chest. Their father had always told them that dignity couldn't be taken, only given away. Standing there on that sidewalk, they embodied that lesson. The brother's athletic discipline and the sister's academic precision merged into something powerful, a quiet strength that was impossible to ignore. They weren't just standing up for themselves, they were standing up for every kid who'd ever felt powerless in a similar situation. The crowd grew larger and whispers rippled through it. The sister heard fragments of conversations, caught glimpses of text messages being sent. Their small corner of the world was becoming a stage, and they were holding their ground with grace. The officers' questions became less aggressive, their stance less intimidating, as if the teenagers' composed resistance was slowly deflating their authority. Then came the sound they'd been waiting for, quick, purposeful footsteps approaching from the direction of their home. Their father's distinct walk, the sound of his dress shoes on pavement, was as familiar to them as their own heartbeats. But they didn't turn to look. They maintained their position, their composure, their dignity. They'd done exactly what they'd been taught to do, and now they could feel the situation about to shift. The morning sun caught their father's Senate pin as he approached, but the siblings didn't need to see it to know he was there. They could feel his presence, strong and reassuring, like a shield at their backs. The regular Tuesday morning that had twisted into something frightening was about to transform again. But whatever happened next, the brother and sister had already won a victory. They'd faced intimidation with dignity, fear with knowledge, and pressure with principles. The sound of dress shoes on pavement cut through the morning tension like a knife through butter. The state senator approached the scene with measured steps, his suit jacket catching the morning light, his Senate pin gleaming on his lapel. He'd been in the middle of preparing for a committee meeting when his daughter's text arrived, but some things took precedence over even state business. The crowd parted like water before him, phones still recording, whispers rippling through the gathered onlookers. The convenience store owner straightened up, newspaper stand forgotten. Even the morning birds seemed to quiet down, as if sensing the shift in the air. The senator's presence carried with it the weight of authority, but not the kind that came from a badge. The kind that came from years of fighting for justice in marble halls and community centers alike. "Officer," he called out, his voice carrying the same powerful calm he used during Senate floor debates. "I believe you're currently detaining my children without probable cause." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Every word landed with the precision of a gavel strike. The taller officer's hand dropped from his belt, his stance shifting from authoritative to uncertain in the space of a heartbeat. The senator stopped beside his children, not in front of them. This wasn't about shielding them. They'd already shown remarkable strength. This was about standing with them. His suit was perfectly pressed, his tie straight, every inch the legislator, but his eyes held the fierce protection of a father. The officers suddenly seemed very aware of their body cameras, their badge numbers, their position in what had become a very public scene. "Senator," the shorter officer started, recognition dawning in his eyes. "We were just conducting a routine check." The words trailed off as the senator raised his hand slightly, the same gesture he used to pause proceedings in committee meetings. The morning sun caught his wedding ring. He still wore it years after losing his wife, a reminder of the principles they'd promised to instill in their children. "A routine check," the senator repeated, his tone making the words sound like evidence being presented to a jury. "Would you mind explaining what's routine about stopping two teenagers walking to school on a public sidewalk? About attempting to search their bags without probable cause or consent?" Each question was delivered with the careful precision of someone who'd spent years crafting legislation about these very issues. The gathered crowd had grown larger, the scene drawing more attention with each passing moment. Some faces in the crowd showed recognition. This was the senator who'd been pushing for police reform, whose speeches about justice had gone viral, whose own experiences had shaped his policy positions. The irony of his children being profiled on their way to school wasn't lost on anyone present. The taller officer cleared his throat, desperation creeping into his voice. "Sir, we had reports of suspicious activity in the area." The senator's eyebrow raised slightly. He'd heard this excuse before, in committee testimonies and community meetings. His children stood quietly beside him, their earlier composure unchanged, a testament to the principles he'd worked so hard to teach them. "I'd be very interested in seeing those reports," the senator replied, pulling out his phone. "In fact, I'm going to make a call to the police chief right now." I'm sure he'd be interested too, especially given our recent discussions about department policy regarding probable cause and community engagement. The words were polite, professional, but the implicit challenge was clear as crystal. The morning bell rang in the distance, its familiar sound somehow foreign in the tense atmosphere. Students who had stopped to watch began shuffling reluctantly toward school, though many lingered, phones still recording. The senator glanced at his children, pride visible in his eyes. They'd handled themselves exactly as they'd been taught, with dignity, knowledge, and strength. The officers exchanged glances, their earlier confidence completely evaporated. The situation had shifted dramatically from what they'd thought would be a routine stop of two teenagers to an incident that would likely land on the police chief's desk before lunch. The shorter officer stepped back slightly, already seeing his career flashing before his eyes. "We'll be filing a formal complaint," the senator continued, his voice level but firm. "Not just about this incident, but about the pattern it represents. My children handled this situation admirably, but I have to wonder about other kids who don't have a state senator for a parent. How many of them have been subjected to these routine checks?" The morning sun had risen higher, casting shorter shadows now. The convenience store owner had long abandoned any pretense of organizing newspapers, watching the scene unfold with undisguised interest. The father placed a gentle hand on each of his children's shoulders, not to comfort them. They'd shown they didn't need that, but to share in their strength. "Officers, I suggest you return to your patrol car now," the senator said, his tone making it clear this wasn't really a suggestion. "Your superior officers will be hearing from me shortly." The morning that had started as a regular Tuesday was rapidly becoming something much more significant, a moment that would spark changes throughout the department and beyond. Within 30 minutes of the senator's arrival, the quiet suburban street had transformed into something resembling a small news conference. Word had spread faster than wildfire in the age of social media, and the videos taken by students were already making rounds on various platforms. The convenience store's security cameras had captured everything from multiple angles, providing clear, unbiased documentation of the entire incident. The police chief's office buzzed with more activity than it had seen in years. Phone lines were lighting up like Christmas trees, email notifications kept pinging, and officers were rushing in and out with stacks of papers and concerned expressions. The morning's incident had set off a chain reaction that was shaking the department to its core. In the main conference room, the chief sat at the head of a hastily assembled emergency meeting. The body camera footage played on the large screen, showing every moment of the unauthorized stop in high definition. Each frame seemed to sink the two officers deeper into trouble. Their faces, visible in the back of the room, had long since lost any trace of the authority they'd shown earlier that morning. "This isn't just about bad publicity," the chief said, pausing the footage. "This is about fundamental failures in our training and protocols." His coffee sat untouched, growing cold as he dealt with what was quickly becoming the biggest crisis of his career. The department's public affairs officer was already drafting the third version of their official statement, each one stronger than the last as the situation's severity became clearer. Outside, protesters had begun gathering. Not angry mobs with signs, but organized groups of community members. Teachers, parents, students, and local leaders. They stood in organized lines, their presence a silent reminder of the community's watchful eyes. Many held up their phones, live-streaming the scene to various social media platforms where the story was trending nationally. The chief's secretary entered with another stack of messages. Civil rights organizations were calling for investigations. Local business owners were sharing security footage that showed the two teenagers walking peacefully past their stores every morning for years. The evidence was mounting, not just about this incident, but about a pattern of similar stops that had gone unreported. "Both officers are on immediate administrative leave," the chief announced to his command staff. "And I want a complete review of every stop they've made in the last 6 months." He rubbed his temples, knowing this was just the beginning. The senator's children had handled the situation perfectly, which made the officers' actions look even worse in comparison. The department's training coordinator sat in the corner, frantically revising protocols. Years of warnings about bias and proper procedure had somehow failed to prevent this incident. Now, with national attention focused on their department, every policy was being scrutinized, every training module questioned. In the break room, younger officers watched the news coverage with mixed emotions. Some felt defensive, others embarrassed, but most were angry at their colleagues for casting a shadow over the entire department. "Those kids did everything right," one officer said, shaking her head. "They knew their rights better than those officers knew the law." The chief's phone rang again, the mayor this time. The city's leadership was scrambling to get ahead of the story, but they were already behind. Social media had turned the morning's events into a national conversation about police accountability. The hashtag was trending, the video clips were viral, and the senator's passionate response was being shared millions of times. Internal affairs investigators had taken over the small conference room, spreading out papers and laptop screens. They weren't just looking at this incident, they were pulling records of every similar stop in the past year. Patterns were emerging that should have been caught earlier, disparities that could no longer be ignored. The department's community liaison officer sat at his desk, head in his hands. He'd spent years building bridges between the police and local residents, especially with young people. Now he watched those bridges strain under the weight of this morning's events. His phone kept buzzing with messages from community leaders demanding answers. By early afternoon, the chief had made his decision. Standing before a forest of microphones and camera lenses, he delivered a statement that would make headlines across the country. No defensive language, no attempt to justify the unjustifiable. Instead, he offered a clear, unequivocal apology and a commitment to immediate action. "What happened this morning was wrong," he stated firmly, his words broadcast live across multiple networks. "The officers involved violated department policy, constitutional rights, and the trust of our community. They have been placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation." The chief paused, then added something not in his prepared statement. "To the young people involved, you showed more understanding of the law and more dignity under pressure than we did. We failed you, and we have to do better." Behind the scenes, the wheels of change were already turning. Training schedules were being rewritten, policies revisited, oversight committees formed. The incident had exposed gaps in the system that could no longer be ignored or explained away. What had started as a routine morning had become a watershed moment for a department that thought it was already progressive enough. In the chief's office, a stack of personnel files sat on the desk, not just the 2 officers involved, but every officer with similar complaints in their history. The time for half measures and gentle corrections was over. The department's response would need to be as clear and unequivocal as the senator's children had been about their rights that morning. 6 months after that fateful Tuesday morning, the changes sparked by a simple walk to school were visible throughout the community. The state's Senate chamber buzzed with activity as legislators gathered to vote on what the media had dubbed the Students' Rights Act. The brother and sister sat in the gallery, watching their father present the bill they had helped inspire. Down at the local high school, things had changed too. The sister now led a new student organization focused on civil rights and civic engagement. What started as a small group meeting in the debate room had grown into one of the largest clubs on campus. Students learned about their rights, role-played scenarios, and shared their own experiences. The brother, still wearing his varsity jacket, often joined to share their story. Remember, he'd tell the gathered students, it's not about being confrontational. It's about knowing your rights and staying calm. His words carried extra weight because everyone had seen the viral videos, how he and his sister had handled that morning with dignity and composure. The footage had become a teaching tool in civil rights classes across the state. The convenience store owner had turned the security camera footage into a powerful statement. The simple corner store now displayed a large Know Your Rights poster in its window, and the owner had become something of a community watchdog. His cameras keeping a protective eye on students walking to school. He'd even added a small sitting area where kids could wait safely if they ever felt uncomfortable. At the police academy across town, new recruits watched body camera footage from that morning as part of their enhanced training program. But now they've also watched interviews with the brother and sister, hearing firsthand how it felt to be profiled, to be treated as suspicious for simply walking to school. The human perspective had become an integral part of police training. The sister's debate skills had found a new purpose. She was regularly invited to speak at community forums, sharing her experience and advocating for continued reform. That morning showed us 2 things, she would say. First, that these incidents can happen to anyone anywhere. And second, that when we stand up for our rights with dignity and knowledge, we can create real change. Their father's role had evolved too. The senator who had always fought for justice now had a personal story to share, one that resonated across party lines. My children did everything right that morning, he would tell his colleagues. But not every child has a state senator for a parent. This isn't about special treatment, it's about ensuring every young person receives the same respect for their rights. The police department had undergone a transformation. The chief's immediate and unequivocal response had set the tone for real change. New training protocols were in place, community oversight had been strengthened, and officers now underwent regular bias awareness sessions. The 2 officers from that morning had been reassigned to desk duty, required to complete extensive retraining before they could return to patrol. Local schools had revised their curricula to include practical civics lessons. Students didn't just learn about constitutional rights in theory. They learned how to exercise them in real-world situations. The brother and sister's experience had shown that knowledge, when paired with composure, could be a powerful tool for change. Community meetings, once sparsely attended, now drew crowds of engaged citizens. Parents shared tips about teaching their children to handle difficult situations. Students discussed their experiences and brainstormed solutions. The incident had sparked an ongoing dialogue about rights, respect, and responsibility that crossed all community boundaries. The brothers' basketball team had adopted a new pre-game tradition. Before every home game, they gathered to recite a pledge about dignity, respect, and standing up for what's right. The sisters' debate team had added civil rights as a permanent category in their competitions, ensuring these important conversations would continue. What had started as a frightening encounter on a quiet suburban street had grown into something much more significant. The changes weren't just in policies and procedures, they were in people's minds and hearts. Students walked to school with greater confidence, knowing their rights and feeling supported by their community. Officers approached their duties with greater awareness and sensitivity. The security cameras that had captured that morning's incident still watched over the corner of Pine and Maple, but they now saw a different scene. Students walking to school would wave to the convenience store owner, stop to read the Know Your Rights poster, and carry themselves with the quiet confidence that comes from knowledge and community support. 1 year to the day after the incident, the brother and sister stood again on that same corner, but this time by choice. They were surrounded by community members, local leaders, and many of the students they'd helped educate about their rights. The sister held up her debate tournament trophy. She'd won the state championship with a speech about civil rights and community change. The brother wore his basketball captain's jersey, his team having dedicated their season to promoting dignity and respect. Their father, still every inch the dedicated senator, stood back and watched his children address the gathered crowd. The changes they'd helped create went far beyond new laws and policies. They'd shown that when young people stand up for their rights with dignity and knowledge, they can transform a moment of injustice into a movement for lasting change. The corner of Pine and Maple was no longer just an intersection. It had become a symbol of how wisdom, composure, and community support could turn an ordinary Tuesday morning into an extraordinary catalyst for positive change.